the buried secret, and the neutral witness one, is the shocking discovery, a forgotten letter. In the dusty archives of an ancient library in Alexandria, a discovery was made that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the most influential figure in human history. A weathered scroll, hidden for nearly 2 millennia, lay untouched among thousands of yellowed parchments. This wasn't just any document. This was something historians had speculated about but never confirmed. The private accounts of Flavius Josephus about Jesus of Nazareth. My hands trembled as I carefully unfolded the brittle pages. This wasn't the well-known Jewish antiquities or the Jewish war that scholars have analyzed for centuries. This was something entirely different, a personal letter. Written not for Rome, not for Jerusalem, but seemingly for posterity itself. I write what is expected of me in my official works. The opening lines read, "But here I record what my eyes have witnessed about the man from Nazareth, whose shadow grows ever larger across the empire. Even as Rome tries to erase his memory, what makes this discovery so extraordinary isn't just its age or preservation. It's the identity of its author. Flavius Josephus wasn't a follower of Jesus. He wasn't a Christian evangelist with a message to spread. He was a Jewish historian, educated, skeptical, and fiercely loyal to historical accuracy. A neutral witness whose testimony holds a weight that the Gospels, written by devoted followers, cannot claim in the same way. Id. R. Josephus's unique position in history. Who was this man whose words bridge worlds separated by faith and skepticism? By Rome and Jerusalem, by history and legend. Born Joseph ben Matityahu in Jerusalem around 37 AD. Just a few years after the crucifixion of Jesus, Josephus lived at the crossroads of history. He was raised in a priestly Jewish family, educated in the traditions of his ancestors, yet later embraced the Roman world that had conquered his homeland. He became the historian who documented the destruction of his own people's temple, while living under the patronage of the very emperors who ordered that destruction. In the world of historical scholarship, Josephus is revered for his meticulous chronicles. His works, The Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities, remain our most comprehensive sources on first-century Judea. When archaeologists uncover sites from that era, it is often Josephus they turn to first for context and confirmation. But it's a brief passage in Jewish Antiquities, written around 93 AD, that has captivated scholars for centuries, the famous Testimonium Flavianum. In just a few short lines, Josephus mentions Jesus, who was called Christ, describing him as a wise man who performed surprising deeds and who, despite his crucifixion, inspired followers who had not ceased their devotion. For generations, scholars have debated whether these words were truly Josephus's or later Christian interpolations. The debate continues to this day. But what if there was more? What if Josephus had written a more detailed, private account of his investigations into the life of this Nazarene who had shaken the foundations of the ancient world? The contrast between the historian and faith Josephus stood at a unique vantage point in history. Unlike the apostles who walked with Jesus, he had no personal loyalty to defend. Unlike the Roman authorities who condemned him, he had no political necessity to denounce this movement. He was, perhaps, the most qualified neutral observer of his time, a mind trained in Jewish law and philosophy, yet open to the broader Hellenistic world of ideas. I seek not to defend, nor to condemn, Josephus writes in the newly discovered letter, "I seek only to record what remains when legends are stripped away and witnesses are questioned with care. For I am a historian first, before I am anything else." This tension between the cold eye of historical inquiry and the burning fervor of early Christian faith creates the perfect crucible for truth. When a non-believer acknowledges something remarkable, we lean in closer. When a skeptic admits to evidence that challenges his worldview, we pay special attention. The accounts collected by Josephus came not from devotion, but from curiosity, not from faith, but from fact-finding. And perhaps that makes them all the more compelling. I did not begin this inquiry expecting to find anything beyond another failed Messiah. The letter continues, "Jerusalem has seen many such figures come and go, but what I discovered was something that defied simple categorization, a movement that should have died with its leader yet somehow grew stronger after his death." As night falls on our journey into this remarkable document, we must ask ourselves, what did Flavius Josephus, the great Jewish historian who owed his life and livelihood to Rome, really discover about the carpenter from Nazareth? What truth was so compelling that it deserved recording in a private letter, separate from his public works? And why has this account remained hidden for nearly 2,000 years? The answers lie in a journey that took Josephus from the marble halls of Rome to the dusty streets of Jerusalem. From conversations with emperors to whispered accounts from aging witnesses who had seen with their own eyes the man who divided history in two. Flavius Josephus, A Life Between Two Worlds id. Origins and Youth of Josephus, Jerusalem. 37 ad. A city of stone and faith, where the echoes of prophets mingled with the footsteps of Roman soldiers. Into this world of colliding empires and ancient traditions, Joseph ben Mattityahu was born. His was no ordinary family, but one descended from the Hasmonean royal line and belonging to the first of the 24 orders of priests that served in the great temple. My earliest memories, Josephus writes in his newly discovered letter, are of the temple's gleaming marble, the smoke of sacrifices rising to heaven, and my father's patient voice teaching me the law of Moses. Young Joseph received an education reserved for the elite of Jewish society. By 16, he had mastered the complex philosophies of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. By 19, he had journeyed to Rome on a diplomatic mission, witnessing firsthand the awesome power and spectacle of the empire that held his homeland in its grip. These were extraordinary times. The landscape of Judea still trembled with the aftershocks of a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Though Josephus was too young to have witnessed Jesus himself, the controversy surrounding this executed teacher had not faded. If anything, it had intensified. In the streets and synagogues, he recalls, arguments would erupt about the Nazarene. Some said he was a blasphemer, justly executed. Others whispered of miracles and appearances after death. As a young scholar, I noted these accounts but paid them little attention. There had been many messianic claimants before, and I expected this movement would soon fade like all the others. How wrong the young priest would be. The Jewish revolt and transformation of fate. The year 66 AD marked a turning point not only in Josephus's life, but in the history of the Jewish people. Tensions that had simmered for decades boiled over into open rebellion against Rome. The Great Jewish Revolt had begun. At 29 years old, Josephus found himself appointed as military governor of Galilee, the same region where Jesus had conducted much of his ministry. With little military experience, he was thrust into commanding the defense against the might of Rome's legions. I fortified cities and tried to train an army. He writes, but in my heart, I knew we could not prevail against Rome's might. This was a war we could not win. After the fortress of Jotapata fell following a 47-day siege, Josephus found himself trapped in a cave with 40 of his soldiers. What happened next would haunt him forever and brand him a traitor in the eyes of many Jews. The soldiers made a suicide pact, drawing lots to determine who would kill whom. Whether by fate or calculation, Josephus was one of the last 2 men standing, and he persuaded his remaining companion to surrender to the Romans. Brought before the Roman general Vespasian, Josephus made a bold prophecy. Vespasian would become emperor of Rome. When this prediction came true, in 69 AD, Vespasian spared Josephus's life and granted him freedom. Josephus adopted the family name of his patrons, becoming Flavius Josephus, and accompanied Titus, Vespasian's son, to witness the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. I stood on the hills above the city of my birth. Josephus recounts, his writing suddenly unsteady, and watched as the temple, our holy sanctuary, the center of our world, was consumed by flames. The screams of my people reached heaven, and my tears fell upon the ground of my ancestors. In that moment, I was neither fully Roman nor fully Jewish, but a man torn between worlds. San Flavius Josephus under Roman patronage. In Rome, Josephus was given an apartment in Vespasian's former residence, a generous pension, and Roman citizenship. To his Roman benefactors, he had proven his loyalty. To many of his Jewish countrymen, he had become the ultimate betrayer. In the streets of Rome, he writes, I was respected as a scholar and historian, but in my dreams, I heard the voices of Jerusalem calling me traitor and deserter. These accusations haunted me more than any earthly enemy ever could, perhaps to justify his actions, perhaps to preserve his people's history. Josephus began writing his first work, The Jewish War, told the story of the rebellion and its crushing defeat. Later came Jewish Antiquities, a monumental history of the Jewish people from creation to his own time. Outwardly, Josephus appeared to have adapted perfectly to Roman life. He married, fathered children, and built a reputation as a serious intellectual of late. But his letter reveals a man plagued by doubt and divided loyalties. I wrote what Rome needed to hear. The letter confesses, but I could not forget the stories that had followed me from Judea. Stories of the Nazarene who had died, but whose movement refused to die. In the quiet of night, when the city slept, I found myself returning again and again to the question, who was this Jesus? And why did his memory persist where all others had faded? It was around this time that Josephus included his famous reference to Jesus in Jewish Antiquities, but the public mention was brief, almost cautious. What his letter now reveals is that behind this professional restraint lay a burning curiosity that would lead him to undertake a dangerous journey back to the homeland he had left behind. I told the emperor I needed to gather more historical records. Josephus writes, but in truth, I sought answers to questions that had begun to consume me. If the movement started by Jesus was merely human in origin, it should have crumbled after his execution. Instead, it was growing, spreading not through force of arms, but through conviction, even in the heart of Rome itself. As he prepared for his journey, Josephus experienced a dream that would shake him to his core. "I saw myself standing on Golgotha," he writes, "but the central cross was empty, its ropes hanging loose. When I looked up at the star-filled sky, I saw a light moving toward Jerusalem, a light no human words can describe." The historian awoke trembling, his scholar's skepticism battling with a sense that he stood at the threshold of a mystery larger than he had imagined. With the reluctant blessing of his Roman patrons, Flavius Josephus set sail for Judea, ostensibly to gather materials for his histories, but in reality, to follow the footsteps of a man who had died 4 decades earlier, yet somehow refused to be forgotten. The journey to discover the portrait of Jesus 3. Initial records from Rome. Before setting sail for Judea, Josephus had already begun his investigation from Rome itself, the imperial city, contrary to what many might expect, hosted a growing community of followers of the Way, as the early Christians called their faith. These were not just converted Jews, but Romans who had embraced this strange Eastern cult that worshipped a crucified man as divine. In his letter, Josephus reveals his methodical approach. "I began by examining what I had already written in my antiquities, the passage that mentioned Jesus, which I had composed based on earlier reports. I wrote that he was a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly." These words, measured and cautious, were what I could safely commit to a public work. But the historian's private thoughts went deeper. What I could not write publicly was how this movement had survived Nero's persecutions, how it spread without armies or wealth or political power. This defied all historical precedent. Movements die when their leaders die. This is the pattern of history. Yet here was one that grew stronger after its founder's execution. Josephus documents his interviews with Roman officials who had dealt with the Christians. One centurion, recently returned from Jerusalem, told him, "They are not seditious like other Jewish factions. They pay their taxes and pray for the emperor. Yet they cannot be made to worship our gods, even under threat of death. I have seen them face lions in the arena with songs on their lips." This peculiar courage intrigued Josephus. What could inspire such devotion? What truth or delusion could be so powerful? Even more surprising were the converts from Rome's elite families. I spoke with a senator whose daughter had joined this sect. Josephus writes, "He was a man of learning and skepticism, yet even he confessed bewilderment. My daughter was ever practical and thoughtful. He told me, now she speaks of this Jesus as if she had known him personally, though he died before her birth. Whatever has captured her mind has not diminished her intelligence, but redirected it." These accounts, collected in Rome, painted a picture that both fascinated and disturbed Josephus, but he knew that to truly understand, he must return to where it all began. The decision to return to the land of Israel, Josephus's planned journey, was met with suspicion by Roman officials. His letter reveals a tense exchange with a high-ranking member of the imperial court. "Why this interest in a dead cult leader?" the prefect demanded, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "Have you not documented enough about Jewish rebellions?" The question carried an implicit threat. Rome had crushed the Jewish revolt just years earlier, and any connection to potential unrest was dangerous. "I am a historian," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And this movement, whether divine or human in origin, has survived your crucifixions and lions. Does that not merit historical investigation? Permission was reluctantly granted. But Josephus understood the dangerous game he played. He would be watched. His writings would be scrutinized. Any perceived sympathy for this outlawed sect could cost him his position or his life. Yet something drove him forward. The recurring dreams had become more vivid. I saw Jerusalem as it was before destruction. He writes, "In the dream, I walked its streets as a boy again, but always my steps led me to Golgotha, where 3 crosses stood silhouetted against the sky, and always the middle cross was empty." Josephus prepared for his journey with the thoroughness of both scholar and survivor. He arranged meetings with Jewish communities, gathered letters of introduction to Roman officials in Judea, and studied the reports of Jesus' activities that had circulated among both supporters and detractors. I sailed from Ostia in the spring. The letter continues, telling myself I pursued only historical truth. But in the silence of night, as the ship cut through dark waters, I confronted the real question that drove me: if Jesus was truly who his followers claimed, what did that mean for me? A Jew who had turned to Rome, a priest who had abandoned the temple's cause. Traveling through the lands Jesus had visited, Josephus's journey through Galilee forms perhaps the most vivid section of his letter. The historian walked the same paths Jesus had walked, visited the same villages, and spoke to people who claimed to have witnessed his miracles firsthand. Capernaum sits by the shimmering lake, where they say he calmed a storm with a word. Josephus writes, "The fishermen still tell the story as if it happened yesterday. Not 4 decades ago, my father was in that boat. An old man told me, his weathered hands mending nets just as his ancestors had done. He was never a man given to fancy. My father, he said the waves were taller than a house. Then, suddenly as flat as a table when the teacher spoke, he feared the teacher more than the storm after that." In Bethsaida, Josephus encountered something unexpected, tangible evidence of healing. "I met a man of about 50 years, strong and straight-backed, walking with confident strides. 'You see nothing remarkable in me now,' he said when I sought accounts of Jesus. 'But ask anyone here who remembers. For 30 years, I dragged myself through these streets on twisted limbs, until he touched me.' The man's neighbors confirmed his story. One elderly woman wept as she described the transformation. We had seen him crawl like a broken insect since childhood. Then one morning, he walked to my door, standing tall as any man. I did not recognize him until he spoke, but the most affecting encounter came in a small village outside Jerusalem. A boy of 12 approached me. Having heard I was asking about the Nazarene, "My mother says I should tell you my story," he said. He was a handsome child with clear, direct eyes. "I was born blind," he continued, matter-of-factly. "When I was 6, he came to our village. Others pushed me forward, saying, 'Master, heal him.' The boy's voice took on a strange maturity, but he did something different. He knelt down to my height. No one had ever done that before. And he asked me, 'What do you want?' No one had ever asked what I wanted either. They always told me what I needed. I said I wanted to see the birds that I could only hear singing." Josephus records the emotion in the boy's voice as he continued, "When he touched my eyes, the first thing I saw was his face, smiling at me. Then I saw my mother's face, and then the birds, just as I had imagined them." Josephus admits in his letter, "I am a historian trained to doubt, to question, to seek natural explanations. But the consistency of these accounts, told by people who had nothing to gain and potentially much to lose by such testimony, gave me pause. Either I had encountered the most elaborate and purposeless web of lies ever woven, or something extraordinary had indeed occurred in these hills. San C. Witnessing the legacy and impact of Jesus beyond individual stories of miracles, Josephus was struck by the social transformation that had taken root in villages where Jesus had taught. He found communities that operated on principles at odds with the hierarchical Roman world and even traditional Jewish society. In one home where followers gathered, he writes, "I witnessed something remarkable. A wealthy merchant served food to a former slave. A Jewish elder discussed scripture with a Greek tradesman. Women spoke with the authority usually reserved for men. When I asked about this unusual arrangement, they said simply, 'In Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female.'" This radical social equality fascinated Josephus, who had moved through the highly stratified worlds of both Jerusalem's priesthood and Rome's imperial hierarchy. But not all reactions to Jesus' legacy were positive. In Jerusalem, now being rebuilt after its destruction, Josephus met with religious leaders who viewed Jesus as a dangerous heretic. One elderly Pharisee who had been present at Jesus' questioning before the Sanhedrin told me, "He threatened everything, the temple, the law, our very covenant with God. He acted as if he had authority to forgive sins, which belongs to God alone. What would remain of our faith if such ideas took root?" Josephus records this tension with scholarly detachment, but notes, "What struck me was that even his enemies never denied the power of his words or the reality of his acts. They disputed their source and meaning, attributing to demons what his followers attributed to God, but not their occurrence." Roman officials provided yet another perspective. One centurion stationed in Jerusalem during Pilate's administration told Josephus, "We had crucified dozens of would-be messiahs and rebels. None are remembered. This one wouldn't die, not his memory, not his movement, despite floggings, despite crucifixions of his followers. They multiplied like seeds scattered by the wind." As Josephus traveled through the region, he discovered a pattern that defied conventional historical understanding. Where persecution was fiercest, the movement grew strongest. Where arguments against it were loudest, its adherents were most committed. This inverted all my understanding of how movements rise and fall. By the end of his journey through Jesus' former territories, Josephus had compiled a remarkable body of testimony from supporters, critics, and neutral observers. But the historian knew that to truly understand this phenomenon, he needed to speak with those closest to the center of the story, the family Jesus had left behind, and the disciples who had walked with him. With a mixture of scholarly interest and growing personal investment, Josephus prepared for these most sensitive interviews, aware that they might challenge not only his understanding of Jesus, but his understanding of history itself. As I arranged these meetings, his letter concludes this section. "I reminded myself of my training as a historian, to question, to doubt, to seek corroboration. But increasingly, another voice whispered that I was approaching a truth that transcended historical method, a truth that might demand not just acknowledgement, but response. Testimonies from the family and disciples of Jesus 4. The meeting with Mother Mary, in a small whitewashed house on the outskirts of Nazareth. Josephus, experienced what he would later describe as the most profound encounter of his investigation. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was by then an elderly woman, her face etched with lines of both sorrow and serenity. Despite her advanced age, her eyes retained a clarity that unsettled the historian. "I had spoken with emperors and high priests," Josephus writes, "yet I found myself uncharacteristically nervous before this simple Galilean woman. What does one ask the mother of a man whom thousands now worship as divine?" Mary received him with quiet dignity, offering water and bread, as was customary. When Josephus explained his purpose to document an accurate account of her son, she studied him with penetrating eyes before responding, "Many have come asking about my son," she said. "Some seek to worship, others to discredit. What do you seek?" Historian of Rome, Josephus describes how her direct question caught him off guard. "I found myself unable to offer my practiced explanation. Instead, I heard myself say simply, 'The truth, whatever it may be.'" What followed was an account of Jesus from the perspective only a mother could provide. Mary spoke of his birth, circumstances so unusual that she had pondered them in her heart for decades. She described a child who asked questions in the temple that left scholars astonished, who seemed to understand his purpose with uncanny clarity, even as a boy. There was a light in his eyes, Mary told Josephus, her voice soft with remembrance. A light that never dimmed, not even in his darkest moments. When other children spoke of what they wanted to become, he spoke of why he had come. The historian's questions turned to the miracles attributed to Jesus. Mary's response was unexpected. The water becoming wine at Cana was not the first wonder. She said, his first miracle was laughter, the way he could make the burdened heart suddenly light. Before he healed bodies, he healed spirits, crushed by the weight of our harsh world. As their conversation continued into evening, Mary revealed something that Josephus found particularly significant. Even I did not always understand his purpose. There were times when his family thought him, perhaps not of sound mind. The crowds, the challenges to authority, the growing danger, we wanted to protect him from himself. Her voice faltered as she described, witnessing his crucifixion. No mother should see such things. I watched them drive nails through hands I had once held as he took his first steps. I heard them mock the voice that had first called me mother. But it was her account of the days after his death that most affected Josephus. I was shattered, empty, as his tomb would prove to be. When they told me he had risen, I did not believe at first. But then he came to me, alone, before the others. No words passed between us. None were needed. A mother knows her son, Josephus admits in his letter, not easily moved. The horrors of war have hardened me, yet as this woman spoke, I found my vision blurred with unexpected tears. Whether her account was truth or the most beautiful delusion ever conceived, the love with which she spoke transcended ordinary testimony. R. Conversation with James and the brothers. Josephus's meeting with James, known as the Just and leader of the Jerusalem church, offered a stark contrast to his encounter with Mary. Where she had been gentle and reflective, James was intense and challenging. As the brother of Jesus who had become a pillar of the emerging Christian community, his perspective was uniquely valuable. James received me in a simple room where followers gathered in secret. Josephus writes, his resemblance to descriptions of his brother was striking, the same penetrating gaze. Though weathered by years of hardship, His reputation for rigorous adherence to Jewish law was evident in his austere appearance. The historian did not receive a warm welcome. Jews call you traitor. Romans call you their historian. James said without preamble, "Who are you when you write about my brother, a scholar seeking truth or a man trying to please his masters?" The question pierced just like a blade. In his letter, he confesses, "No diplomatic training prepared me for such directness. I started to offer explanations about historical objectivity, but they sounded hollow even to my ears. For this man had paid for his convictions with suffering, while I had secured comfort through compromise." What followed was a tense but revelatory conversation. James admitted that during Jesus' ministry, his own family had struggled to comprehend his mission. "We thought him possessed by delusions of grandeur," James acknowledged. "I, his own brother, mocked what I could not understand." Then James reached for a small wooden box. Everything changed after his death, he said. Opening the container, inside lay a folded piece of linen cloth, yellowed with age. "This is a portion of his burial cloth," James explained. "We found it folded neatly in the empty tomb. Not torn, not stolen, folded, as if removed with care. There is no blood on it, though his body was covered in wounds." Josephus describes touching the fabric. It had an unusual texture, as though it had passed through fire without burning. When I asked if I could take it for examination, James smiled for the first time. "It is not evidence to be studied. Historian, it is a witness to be encountered." The conversation turned to James's own transformation. Once skeptical of his brother's claims, he had become willing to die for them. "What changed you?" Josephus asked. "I saw him," James replied simply. "After his death, he appeared to me, not a spirit, not a vision. He ate with me, spoke with me, my brother, yet transformed, the same, yet entirely new." Josephus pressed for details, seeking inconsistencies as any good investigator would, but James's account remained steady, matching in key details what others had independently told the historian. Before Josephus departed, James issued a challenge that would haunt him. "You record history." Josephus, "But my brother is not merely historical. He stands at the door of every heart, including yours, waiting for an answer that transcends scholarly inquiry." San, Mary Magdalene and the story of the empty tomb. Of all witnesses Josephus interviewed, none left a more indelible impression than Mary Magdalene. His letter describes her as neither young nor beautiful by Roman standards, but possessing a quiet intensity that commanded attention. Rumors had long circulated about her past, but Josephus found a woman of remarkable eloquence and conviction. Their meeting took place near the garden tomb, where she had reportedly been the first to discover Jesus' body missing. As they walked the grounds, Josephus noticed a long scar on her wrist, partially visible beneath her sleeve. When he inquired about it, Mary's response opened a window into her personal history with Jesus. "Before I met him, I tried to end my life," she said quietly, unconsciously touching the scar. 7 demons. The people said, "Perhaps that was true. I only know I was tortured from within, cast out by all, including myself." She described her first encounter with Jesus. "He looked at me, really saw me, when everyone else turned away. He spoke my name in a way that made me feel named for the first time. Not the possessed woman, not the sinner, but Mary." Her account of the resurrection morning came alive with sensory details that struck Josephus as the mark of genuine memory rather than constructed narrative. The air smelled of aloes and myrrh. Birds were just beginning to sing. I remember the weight of the spices we carried, the worry about moving the stone, then the shock of that open tomb, black, gaping like a wound against the pale rock. Mary's voice trembled as she continued. We thought they had taken his body, a final indignity. I ran to tell the others, then returned alone, blind with tears. That's when I saw someone I thought was the gardener. Josephus writes that her expression transformed as she recalled the moment. When he said my name, Mary, I knew, the way no one else said it. The world stopped. Everything before and after hinges on that single moment when the impossible stood before me. Calling my name. The historian asked the question any skeptical investigator would pose. Could grief have created an illusion, a desperate hope manifesting as vision? Mary's response was not defensive but reflective. I have asked myself the same. But would an illusion have transformed not just me but everyone who encountered it? Would it have given Peter courage to face crucifixion, Thomas conviction to travel to distant lands, or me purpose when I had none? Does illusion create new life that endures for decades? Before they parted, Mary made a gesture that Josephus found deeply moving. She took his hand and placed it over her scarred wrist. Before him, death was my only hope. After him, even death has lost its power. That is not philosophy. Historian, that is transformation. C. The disciples and the meeting with Longinus. Josephus's encounters with Jesus's closest disciples provided crucial testimony from those who had witnessed his ministry firsthand. Peter, by then an elderly man with weather-beaten features, spoke with the plain speech of the fisherman he had once been. He was not what we expected. Peter told Josephus, we wanted a warrior to drive out Rome, a king to restore Israel's glory. He gave us something altogether different and far greater, though we were too blind to see it then. Peter's account of the miracles was detailed and matter-of-fact. I saw him calm a storm with a word. I watched him feed thousands with a boy's lunch. I saw Lazarus walk out of his tomb after 4 days dead. These were not tricks done in shadows or distant rumors. They happened before crowds, in daylight, defying explanation. The disciple John, described by Josephus as younger than the others, with an almost poetic way of speaking, offered a more reflective perspective. The signs and wonders were not the heart of his mission. They were merely signposts pointing to who he was. The greatest miracle was love embodied perfectly in human form. Love strong enough to surrender to death rather than compromise its nature. But perhaps the most remarkable interview came unexpectedly, through a clandestine meeting arranged in the back room of a Roman tavern. There, amid the smell of wine and sweat, Josephus came face to face with a man who provided a perspective from the other side of the cross, Longinus, the centurion who had overseen the crucifixion. I could be executed merely for speaking with you about this, the Roman soldier said, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped his cup. But I must tell someone what my eyes witnessed on Golgotha. Longinus described the crucifixion in the detached manner of a soldier who had supervised many such executions. It was routine until it wasn't. This Jew was different. No curses, no pleas for mercy. When he spoke forgiveness for us as we drove in the nails, he had crucified hundreds. Historian, none died. Like him, the centurion leaned forward, lowering his voice. Then came the darkness at midday. Not a storm cloud. The air was still. Darkness, like night falling at noon. The earth shook. Graves opened. I have been in battles across the empire, but never felt fear like that moment. Josephus records the soldiers' most stunning claim. We were ordered to break their legs to hasten death before the Sabbath. The thieves still lived. So, we broke them. But Jesus was already dead, unusual for crucifixion, which typically takes days. I pierced his side to confirm death. Blood and water flowed separately, a detail I noticed only because it was unusual. When Josephus pressed him about the reports of resurrection, Longinus replied, "I can only tell you what I know firsthand. We were ordered to guard the tomb because of rumors he would rise. Good soldiers were posted. Men I trained myself. Yet they returned with wild tales of blinding light, and the stone moved. They were not cowards or fools. Whatever they saw terrified men who had faced barbarian hordes without flinching. The tension of the meeting suddenly escalated when a patrol of Roman soldiers entered the tavern. Josephus describes the moment. We fell silent instantly. Longinus pulled his cloak closer to hide his identity. As the patrol passed near our table, I felt the weight of worlds colliding. My position in Rome now a hair's breadth from a secret that could destroy it. After the soldiers departed, Longinus made a confession that clearly troubled Josephus deeply. I have served Rome faithfully for 30 years, but since that day on Golgotha, I have awakened each night from the same dream of a man who died under my watch, but somehow lives, whose eyes knew me better than I know myself, and whose forgiveness weighs heavier than all my guilt. As Josephus prepared to leave, Longinus gripped his arm with unexpected force. You're a man caught between worlds, just as I am. You'll write what Rome permits about all this, but we both know some truths are too dangerous for official histories, yet too important to be forgotten. In his letter, Josephus reflects, I had sought witnesses who contradicted each other, whose testimonies would reveal inconsistencies that explain away this movement. Instead, I found a tapestry of accounts from family who initially doubted him, women whose testimony would be dismissed in court, fishermen with no reason to fabricate, and even a Roman executioner, all converging on a reality I had not anticipated and could not easily dismiss. The unquenchable flame and the secret letter 5 is return to Rome and inner conflict. The ship that carried Josephus back to Rome sailed under leaden skies, a fitting backdrop to the historian's troubled mind. His investigation had yielded far more than the scholarly documentation he had anticipated. He returned not just with scrolls of notes, but with questions that shook the foundations of his carefully constructed life. As the coastline of Italy appeared on the horizon, he writes, I felt not the relief of homecoming, but the weight of a truth I was not prepared to carry. What does one do with evidence that defies rational explanation, yet cannot be dismissed as mere superstition? Josephus had barely settled in his Roman quarters when a message arrived summoning him to the imperial palace. Emperor Domitian, suspicious by nature and hostile to any perceived threats to his authority, demanded an account of the historian's journey. The meeting still haunted Josephus as he recorded it in his letter. I stood before the emperor in the marble hall where I had once been received as a celebrated scholar. Now his eyes narrowed with suspicion as he examined me like an insect pinned for study. You have spent considerable time investigating this Jewish cult leader, he said, his voice dangerously soft. A curious preoccupation for a man who enjoys imperial patronage. Have you found anything that should... concern us. The question hung in the air like a drawn sword. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity what was expected of me. Any suggestion that Jesus was more than a failed revolutionary, any hint that his movement had legitimate power, would be interpreted as sedition against Rome. Josephus describes his carefully crafted response. I assured the emperor that my research was purely historical, intended to document the rise and fall of various messianic movements for my chronicles. I spoke of Jesus as an interesting but ultimately provincial figure whose followers would inevitably diminish with time. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. That night, Josephus faced the first of many sleepless nights. Torn between historical truth and political survival, I burned my most explicit notes that night. He confesses, in the letter, watched the flames consume testimonies that could condemn me if discovered. Yet by morning, I found myself rewriting them from memory, unable to relinquish what I had learned, even at the risk of my life. This inner conflict between the privileged historian of Rome and the seeker of truth became Josephus's private crucible. I, who had once switched allegiance from Jerusalem to Rome, now found myself caught in a loyalty more demanding than either. Historical truth has no emperor, no temple. It simply is, regardless of who acknowledges it. We are witnessing the Christian community in Rome despite imperial persecution. The followers of Jesus had established a growing presence in Rome itself. Josephus, with his unique position, gained unprecedented access to this underground community. What he witnessed there challenged his conception of power and transformation. They met in catacombs beneath the city. He writes, surrounded by the bones of their dead, yet filled with a vitality that defied their circumstances. I had walked the marble halls of power all my life, yet never felt the raw energy of conviction I encountered in those damp, dark tunnels. Josephus describes the secret symbols that identified believers to one another: the fish ichthes, the anchor, the shepherd, on walls and doors. These simple markings served as a hidden language: Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, the Greek letters of fish forming an acronym for their central belief. The composition of these gatherings particularly struck the historian. Accustomed to Rome's rigid social hierarchies, slaves sat beside their masters. Women spoke with authority. Foreigners were embraced as family. I watched a wealthy patrician woman wash the feet of her former slave, now considered her brother in their faith. In a world built on division and rank, they created an alternative society that inverted everything Rome valued. Most remarkable was their response to persecution. They spoke of those taken to the arena not with fear, but admiration. They called execution birth into true life. When one family lost their father to the lions, the community enfolded them in practical care and genuine love. They grieved, yes, but not as those without hope. Josephus admits his growing respect for what he witnessed. I had seen the temple in Jerusalem, the Senate in Rome, ceremonies honoring emperors as divine. Yet in these simple gatherings, where bread was broken and wine shared in remembrance of their executed teacher, I sensed a more authentic connection to the divine than in all the official religions of the empire. One elderly believer, learning of Josephus's journey to interview witnesses in Judea, made an observation that troubled the historian deeply. You have traveled far to find what is now before you. The man said, you speak with those who saw him with their eyes. Now you sit among those who know him in their hearts. Which testimony is stronger? Those saw him walk the shores of Galilee, or those willing to die rather than deny him in Rome? 5. San, the secret letter and legacy. As Josephus approached the end of his life, the weight of his unshared knowledge became increasingly burdensome. His public works, The Jewish War, Jewish Antiquities, against Apion, had secured his position as the preeminent chronicler of Jewish history. Yet his most significant discovery remained undocumented in these official histories. History is written by the powerful, he reflects in his letter, and controlled by those who determine what may be remembered. My published works contain what could safely be recorded, the brief mentions of Jesus that would not alarm my patrons. But the full account of what I witnessed and what I came to understand, this required a different kind of testament. It was this realization that prompted the creation of the letter now discovered, a private account intended not for his contemporaries, but for future generations. I write these words, not knowing if they will survive. Josephus confesses, I entrust them to the family of Clement, a Roman believer whose discretion I trust. I have instructed them to preserve this account, passing it through generations, until a time when it may safely emerge into the light of historical examination. The most startling revelation comes near the end of the letter, where Josephus discloses a personal connection to the Jesus story that he had never before acknowledged. I must now confess what I have told no one. When I was a child of 7 in Jerusalem, studying with the temple priests as befitted my family's station, I once observed a young teacher whose wisdom astonished the elders. The memory had faded until my interviews with Mary brought it rushing back. I was there, in the temple, when the boy Jesus amazed the scholars with his understanding. Our paths had crossed briefly, though I did not realize it until decades later. Perhaps this forgotten encounter planted the seed of curiosity that eventually led me back to his story. This personal connection adds profound significance to Josephus's investigation, transforming it from scholarly inquiry to a completion of a circle begun in childhood. As the letter approaches its conclusion, Josephus makes his most explicit assessment of Jesus. I began as a historian seeking facts about a movement that defied historical patterns. I speak now as a witness to something that transcends conventional historical categories. Whether one views Jesus of Nazareth as prophet, teacher, or Messiah depends not merely on evidence, though evidence abounds, but on what kind of truth one is prepared to accept. Woo. Sir. Conclusion and interactive message. The final paragraphs of Josephus's letter offer a perspective that spans centuries, as if the historian somehow sensed the enduring impact of the figure he had investigated. Rome believes its empire eternal. Yet I have studied enough history to know all empires fall, temples crumble, dynasties end, civilizations return to dust. Yet the movement begun by this crucified teacher shows no sign of fading. It grows strongest where most fiercely opposed, takes root in hearts that have no earthly reason to embrace it. Josephus concludes with words that sound almost prophetic. I leave this testimony to ages I will not see, to readers yet unborn. Judge for yourselves the evidence I have gathered. The historian in me has done what historians do, documented, corroborated, analyzed. But there comes a point where history opens to something larger, where the record of what happened invites the deeper question of what it means. The ancient letter ends there. Its final page, slightly damaged by time, but its discovery opens new avenues for understanding both Josephus and the historical Jesus. Modern archaeological findings have lent unexpected support to elements of Josephus's account. The discovery of the ossuary bone box inscribed with James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, in 2002 provided physical evidence connecting to individuals mentioned in the letter. Excavations at Capernaum have revealed a house that may have belonged to Peter, just as Josephus described visiting. These discoveries, while not confirming every detail of the letter, suggest that its author possessed knowledge of specific locations and relationships that align with archaeological evidence unavailable until recent times. As we close this extraordinary journey through Josephus's forgotten testimony, we must ask ourselves the question he poses across the centuries: who do you believe Jesus truly was? A wise teacher, a political revolutionary, a prophet, or something far greater, as his followers claimed? The answer to that question has shaped history more profoundly than perhaps any other. Empires have risen and fallen. Civilizations have flourished and faded. Yet the impact of that one life continues to reverberate across time and culture. If you found this exploration of history and faith compelling, please support our work by subscribing to this channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of Josephus's account did you find most persuasive or intriguing? What questions remain unanswered? History's greatest mysteries often lie at the intersection of documented fact and transformative meaning. Flavius Josephus, Caught Between Worlds, offers us a unique window into both, if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. In a world filled with noise and division, the story of Josephus reminds us that the most profound truths often emerge from honest questioning. Like him, many of us find ourselves caught between worlds, between traditional values and changing times, between certainty and doubt, between what we've always believed and what we're discovering. This tension is not a failure of faith, but its refinement. At this stage of life, when we've accumulated enough wisdom to recognize both the value of our convictions and the limits of our understanding, we can appreciate Josephus's journey. We need not fear evidence that challenges us, nor must we abandon the faith that sustains us. The most meaningful growth happens in that sacred space between questioning and believing. Perhaps the most powerful lesson from Josephus's investigation is that transformation rarely comes through intellectual argument alone. It was the changed lives he witnessed, the courage of ordinary people, the radical love they demonstrated, their peace in the face of persecution that most deeply challenged his perspective. In our own relationships with family members who see the world differently, with colleagues whose beliefs seem foreign to us, or with a culture that often appears hostile to faith, we might remember this wisdom. The most compelling testimony isn't always what we say, but how we live with integrity, compassion, and unwavering hope, even in difficult times. Like Josephus, we all leave a letter to the future through our lives. What truth will your life's testimony reveal to those who come after you? What evidence of transformation will others find in the story you're writing today? If Josephus's journey between faith and history has stirred something in your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you believe Jesus truly was? Has your understanding evolved over time? Your perspective adds richness to this ongoing conversation. If you found value in this exploration, please consider supporting our channel by subscribing and clicking the notification bell to receive our upcoming videos on historical figures whose stories intersect with faith. A simple like helps our content reach others who might benefit from these reflections. And sharing this video with friends or family could spark meaningful discussions about the evidence of faith in history. Join us next week as we explore another hidden figure whose testimony changed the course of religious understanding.